Today, we are joined by Dr. Jonathan Fowler, who is a two-time Commonwealth Scholar and a professor of archaeology at St. Mary's University in Halifax. He is also the owner and principal of Northeast Archaeological Research. He holds a DPhil in archaeology from the University of Oxford and an MA in landscape archaeology from the University of Sheffield. He's also an alumnus at St. Mary's University and got his undergrad degree there. His research interests are wide-ranging and include landscape archaeology, historical archaeology, imperialism, and archaeological geophysics, including research in the UK, Greece, Hungary, Cuba, and Antigua and Barbuda. Jonathan has authored more than 150 research reports, scholarly articles, and book chapters, and his work employs both traditional and high-tech archaeological methods to improve our understandings of past places and events. He's joining us today to talk about his historical archaeological work on a long-term research project he's been conducting at the Grand Pre National Historic Site and UNESCO World Heritage Site, and also, we wanted to promote that he has his latest book, Diaries of the Acadian Deportations, Volume 2, John Winslow at Grand Pre, co-written with Earl Lockerbie, is coming out this fall by Gaspereau Press. So thank you, Jonathan, for joining us today.
Thanks for joining us, Jonathan. Congratulations on the new book.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for the invitation. The book was a bit of a sweat, I have to say. I'm glad it's coming out at long last.
Maybe actually just before we start here, there's what was Volume 1 about in that series, which you also did?
Yeah, so I'll step back. The concept for the series is to bring to publication a collection of primary sources that give eyewitness testimony to the deportation of the Acadians. And the first one was one of those. It was a very little known and very small account, a diary, a daybook of a soldier named Jeremiah Bancroft. The document had been known to a small number of historians for a number of years, but really had very little broader public currency. So we published that one first. In fact, it's over that I met Earl, my friend and collaborator. And then we just carried on. But the Winslow book is far more complex. It's kind of like, in nautical terms, it'd be like comparing a canoe to a battleship. So the Winslow book is much larger, more complicated, more involved, and it took a lot longer to do.
Well, fortunately, Gaspereau Press books are kind of built like battleships, in my experience, with the hand-sewn binding and the extremely thick paper.
What's Trevor's line? They've got a great hand feel.
Yes. Trevor's
yeah. No, it's true, and in fact, I'll say this, certainly not to blow my horn, but to give accolades to Andrew Steeves at Gaspereau, because he's really the designer who we've collaborated with. Andrew is an artist, proper artist, and the Bancroft book won a National Design Award. We were so pleased with it. We took a long time to come up with a design that we thought worked, that allowed the reader to go back and forth between the primary source and our gloss, which contained not only just footnotes. And Andrew, in designing the Bancroft book, the first book, did such a great job. And it allows the reader to go back and forth kind of seamlessly between the primary source text itself of Bancroft's diary and our gloss and discussions and elaborations and little asides. And we've taken the same approach with the Winslow book. So it allows readers to engage with the historical material, but at the same time read a book on almost a parallel track as these two historians are ruminating on the contents.
Very
That's
cool.
Great.
Yeah. So did the listener will hear that you're drawing on these archival documents and sort of diaries and things like that. And so you're a historical archaeologist. And so can you tell the listener a bit about historical archaeology, so the time periods that you're studying and how your work might differ from the kinds of research and sources that someone specializing, for example, in pre-contact archaeology might draw from?
Well, sure. Archaeology is such a fascinating discipline. It really is a discipline that works in many different domains. And for the historical archaeologist, we are doing all the traditional field archaeological things. We're prospecting for sites, we're conducting surveys, we're doing all sorts of field analyses. We may chat a little bit later about remote sensing and terrestrial geophysics and the like. But we dig holes, whether they're test pits or formal excavation units, and all of that concern for context and stratigraphy and for the material record and all of its complexity. So that is present. But additionally, in historical archaeology, we have the benefit of the text. Not everywhere and not at all times. And texts can be very problematic, certainly at times. But we have some kind of written record to rely on, and then compare and contrast and collate. And that text, I would say, goes beyond just the written word. It could include other things, including cartography. I just love old maps, find them fascinating and beautiful, and again, problematic at times. So artwork, text, photography, you name it. But all of these other things that we tend to find in archives and art galleries, we get to bring into the debate and the discussion. And it makes for, I find, a really rich intellectual pursuit. So that's my small pitch for historical archaeology.
That's right. It's more reading, but still has all the pits. Is the
Yep. All the dirt, all the bug bites, and
right.
And a dust allergy from the archive.
Yeah, exactly.
And so today we're going to travel to pre-Nova Scotia, really, the 17th, 18th century era of what was then Acadia at a place called Grand Pre on the Minas Basin, where you've been doing some work. And could you tell us a bit about the era of occupation you were interested in there, and what's going on in Acadia and the Maritimes at that time?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in, as you say, the 17th, 18th century period. It's a fascinating period, and it's a period that I would say we both know and don't know. Yeah, this is a period that historians have written about for centuries. There's many generations of historians, many different trends in the historiography, a fair bit of public awareness, not always of all of the detail, or even all of the accurate facts of the period, but there's a kind of common knowledge of the period. I find it interesting because it's a period in which different groups of people come together. Colonial encounters we rightly focus on the destructive aspects of colonial encounter, but they're also creative in certain ways. So it's a time of accelerating social change, when different European peoples come together to these shores. Folks like the British, the French, and we know them as modern blocks, but really there's diverse subgroups within those, as well as indigenous people, predominantly the Mi'kmaq in this part of the world, and of course the French, who do something very interesting. They establish a settler population beginning really in the 1630s, although there are some precursors to that. And at some point in the following decades, an ethnic group is born, a national identity is born, and they become the Acadians. So all of this is happening. By the middle of the 18th century, there's a world war. We know it as the 7 Years' War, generally the European expression of it at any rate. And it results in the deportation of the French and Catholic population, the Acadians, and sort of a very destructive war in this part of the world. The cultural experiment that had been initiated by the French with the Acadians was at least severely stalled. A world was destroyed. And of course, that world involves now an archaeological footprint that we can examine and consider in relation to the historical record, and also consider in relation to the broader history of ethnic violence, and see what conclusions we can draw from that. So these themes draw my attention as well.
Like I said, I'm going to interrupt you because I can see Ken reaching for a question, but while we're still on that subject, Jonathan, what are some of the key historical records from this period? Like if you were to name, a couple handful of references of material that you've researched that has been particularly helpful in your work. I just want the listener to get a sense of, like, is it probate records? Is it maps, as you mentioned?
Yeah, it really depends, I would say, on the questions that you bring to the period. If your questions are those of the, say, historical geographer, or the environmental historian, then the cartographic record is really powerful. What's interesting about this period is, and the records it produced, is that it was a very international kind of experience. So the historical records it generated can be found not only here in Nova Scotia, for example, just down the road from where I am right now, the Nova Scotia Archives, but it can be found in the church archives in Quebec, the seminary, for example, the diocese. It can be found in the British National Archives, the British Library. There are maps in the Royal Collection, in Buckingham Palace and their various warehouses. Scotland, the Scottish Archives, on it goes. The French National Archives, the Library of Congress. I mean, I can continue.
All of the good reasons to all the good destinations for good reasons to go do some archaeology work is to just get over to France and spend some days in the archives.
Yeah, very much so. And I think of that a lot, particularly in relation to those generations of historians that came earlier, who I mentioned. They really did have to travel, either that or try to get somebody to sneak in with a camera with an exploding flash bulb or something. But of course, nowadays, so much of this stuff is digital, and it's becoming more and more available digitally. Sadly, in some ways, we're losing our need to travel. But there's also such a richness of material that means that, and I'm just scratching the surface of the cartographic. We could get into the texts, but it's the same dynamic applies. This is a very, very creative time for the making of history and historical inquiry, because we have far more material to work with than our predecessors had, and it's really due to digitization. It's at our fingertips.
Yeah. So when you talked about how much you like maps, one of the first thing I thought about is this sort of the sort of mass digitization of these historical maps, and increasingly some of them are getting georeferenced in interesting ways, and stretching and kind of trying to see how people are visualizing space and stuff like that. And so I guess when you're thinking about cartographic depictions of this area at this time, what are the kinds of things that are appearing on these sorts of maps? Like what's the landscape of Grand Pré look like to the people who are drawing it, I guess, at that time?
Yeah, sadly, it doesn't look like much. We do get maps that tend to be small scale maps. And we know what this means. It means everything on them looks really small. So you're like in Google Earth, but you're zoomed way out. And we get a lot of maps like that. And they're maps by armchair cartographers. Many of them never even visited the region. And you'll look, if you squint, and you'll see something like Grand Pré, a little dot, or maybe a little icon with a church or something like that. But it doesn't I'm speaking to archaeologists here, so you can understand my frustration. Yet it doesn't really help us reconstruct a sense of what that place looked like. How many people lived there? Where were the property lines drawn? How many different types of buildings, and what was their layout on the ground? Roads, cemeteries, mills, etc.
I mean, Jonathan, you could also be describing my sketch maps in my field notebook when I returned them 2 years later. So
Yeah, but at least you've tried. I mean, the other thing that happens is you get these antiquarians who visited these sites in the 19th century when all the cellar holes were still there, and they've left some quite remarkable accounts as well. Very often they say things like, "Oh, yes, you can very clearly see the remains of this village. There's 10 cellars here, and not a map to be seen."
We didn't have a Squire and Davis at Grand Pré, eh?
This is the thing. So this makes it also a really appropriate subject for archaeology, and historically informed archaeology, because despite the fame of this site, despite its impact in literature, Longfellow, Evangeline, the Acadian national reawakening, things we can discuss, it is one of the most well-known and iconic, truly, places in this great sweep of historiography. But we know very little about what it actually looked like, and we need to work awfully hard to figure that out.
Yeah. So let's turn to that for a minute then. And so the deportation obviously is a touchstone in Acadian and Maritimes history, and it's immortalized in various media, including the song by the band. And one of the things that maybe to start off with is just what was the arrangement, and how does it link to Grand Pré?
Right. So it's in a nutshell, in the middle of the 18th century, the local British government. I should even back up. Even this is difficult, guys. Look. So I'll back up one further step. it's a French colony, nominally a French colony. Of course, in the early days, the major population is indigenous. Gradually, the French settler population overtakes the indigenous population. But initially, Mi'kma'ki, okay, Acadie, the French called it. It gets its name from a legal charter that's written in the very early years of the 17th century. The French settler population comes. The French officials, metropolitan officials, tend to call them Acadiens because they are distinguished from the Canadiens, the French settlers of the St. Lawrence River Valley, Canada. So gradually, this part of the world, which was really a frontier zone between the French colonial empire, overseas empire, and the British overseas empire, New England, became kind of a contested zone. And in the early 1700s, the British conquered this place. And with it came this collection of Acadiens, these Acadian colonists who were essentially permitted to stay. And over the next few decades, a series of questions arose as to their status, whether they would be considered British subjects, whether they would be considered some kind of enemy alien. And how you answer that question really depended on your politics and your values. But by and large, the Acadians became subjects of the British Crown. They swore an oath of neutrality around about 1730, we might as well say. And in fact, generally they were called the neutral French in records of this period. So fast forward now to the middle of the 18th century. Britain nominally governs this province, which they call Nova Scotia, New Scotland. It has a population that is largely non-British. It's French, it's indigenous, largely Catholic from the British perspective, not a good thing. They're Protestant. You're coming off of multi-generational religious wars. And so the neutrality of the Acadians was suspect to certain of these British governors. In the summer of 1755, the governor and acting governor, in fact, in council here in Halifax, took the very dread decision to deport the entire population. They, avoiding the weeds, let's just say they set a little bit of a trap for them, and they decided to make this policy happen by stratagem, as is the word that appears in John Winslow's orderly book. And that's essentially what happens. So the summer of 1755, the decision is taken by the British. They send their troops into the communities. They take men and boys hostage, capture them, and hold them as hostages against the good behavior of the women and children and the elderly in the communities until the ships arrive. And it's quite an interesting and grim history. So that's basically the series of events, as I say, in a nutshell. What that leads to is an enormous diaspora. So the Acadians are spread all over the world, initially into the New England colonies, but ultimately they travel far and wide. Some of them end up relocating into what's now the southern U.S., Louisiana. They become the Cajuns. Many others end up in Quebec, others in Europe and other places around the world. It's an amazing story. But at Grand Pre, it's the story of this community that gets attacked by a small detachment of New England soldiers under the command of this fellow from just south of Boston named John Winslow. And he arrives there toward the end of August of 1755 with just over 300 men. And he summons the village elders to a meeting and eventually issues a proclamation ordering all the men and boys to come to the church to hear a proclamation. And when they arrive, of course, they're arrested and this stratagem plays out.
Yeah, so that's Grand Pre. Basically is not just it was a small village, but it's a huge landscape. It's both a National Historic Site and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so, like, from a practical standpoint, what does that mean for the archaeology work that goes on there, and sort of what does the archaeology look like when you're on the ground? Like the kinds of you've mentioned there's some cellars that are you don't see the depressions anymore, but what's the scale and the scope and size of this landscape and this village that you're investigating?
It is multi-scalar for sure. And the thing about archaeology is one of the things that makes archaeology both, I think, really fascinating and compelling, but also sometimes extremely challenging to the point of being maddening is that your subject matter goes from the tiniest speck of a piece of glaze that's flaked off a piece of tin glazed earthenware in a trench fill. It goes from that to, say, John Winslow's military camp, to, say, an ecclesiastical landscape. It's a church, it's a priest's house, it's a cemetery, to a village, to now a field system that involves us in dykeland agriculture. Something we've not really discussed so far in this conversation is that the Acadians performed a strange kind of subsistence agricultural practice by diking and damming and draining tidal wetlands and resulting in very, very fertile farms. But that takes us into a whole other realm of wet site archaeology and landscape scale archaeology, which is accessible now not so easily through test bits. It gets us into remote sensing and LiDAR and things like that. So it's multi-scalar. It is properly landscape archaeology. And the fascinating thing about it is that so little is known of that broad picture. If we were to try to examine this landscape and this story strictly with traditional archaeological methods, I think we'd burn through 100 lifetimes before we got there. We really do need to use landscape scale methods.
So you talked about this, the dykeland farming, and at the risk of causing some PTSD for our listeners who participated in the Petitcodiac project, can you tell us a little bit about a little bit more detail about dykeland farming and Aboiteau?
Ken, that's 8 of our 12 listeners you're referring to there. So,
yeah, exactly.
we should maybe do a longer trigger warning.
Yeah. Sorry, Jesse, and Trevor and Lisa and Darcy. The first project I worked on actually was for a lagoon replacement in outside of Moncton, and we found a very early Aboiteau sluice. And so I've been totally fascinated by the technology since then. So you can tell the listener a little bit about what was going on, how they were using the Grand Pré landscape, and what sort of infrastructure you might have found there.
And when the early French arrived here, they were looking at a landscape that was dominated by forests. Unlike New England, where when the Europeans arrived, they were met by indigenous people who were practicing a form of agriculture and had cleared large areas and were living sedentary lives. Here, the approach was more of a hunter-gatherer fisher economy, and the forests had, they weren't perhaps everywhere, but they were most places. So the French took a look around, and as they did in the St. Lawrence Valley, they discovered, indeed as they did in New England, people discovered the salt marshes or the tidal marshes, the tidal wetlands that we generally don't think very much about today, but they are among the richest ecosystems in this part of the world. They form particularly around the upper reaches of the Bay of Fundy system, so into, say, Cumberland Basin, the Minas Basin, where Grand Pré is located, Annapolis Basin, where the Annapolis River is, where, in fact, the first Acadians began doing this work, diking and draining the marshes. And initially, the marshes were used, as they were in the St. Lawrence Valley and as they were in New England, they were used for grass. You can just do nothing to the marshes, just cut the grass and feed your cattle, and your cattle will thank you. Cattle, of course, are perfectly happy in the woodlands, but come wintertime, you need to feed them. And just the natural grasses growing on the salt water tolerant grasses growing on these marshes are perfect for fodder. And so that's how this resource was used initially. But the Acadians took it one step farther, which was by building permanent dams to dam off sections of these tidal marshes, and then a series of ingenious little devices for draining off the water once the tide has subsided, so the fresh water can drain out. This sluice is the aboiteau structure you're referring to. And piecemeal, many tens of thousands of acres were gradually terraformed into some of the richest farmland in this part of North America. It's a fascinating subject. It's a really ingenious technology. It's a very ancient technology. It goes back to the Iron Age, at least in Europe. But it worked its way into France, and it was brought across the Atlantic by the French in the 17th century. And one of the really interesting things about it, I find, is that here again, there's real opportunity for discovery, because we know in general about the technology. We know in general about Acadian dikeland farming. What we don't know is necessarily the history in detail of any particular marsh, when it was diked and drained, by whom. But now with archaeology, married, I should add, to dendrochronology, so tree ring dating, we have the capacity to recover elements of this diking program and date them and write a history that never was recorded before, because it was all vernacular technology. It would be you and your uncle and your cousin and, building this stuff. There was never a government permit. There was never a license.
You mean they weren't issuing Wawa permits back in
no such thing. No such thing. And so we have the ability through archaeology to create really a historical record of something that was never documented in the traditional sense.
So Jonathan, my understanding is that as a Sheffield grad, written in the bottom of your diploma is in Latin, an obligation that you have to talk about landscape archaeology on every interview. Correct. So I'm glad we give you that opportunity. But
it may happen again.
Yeah, but if we could narrow in a little bit too on place. So Grand Prairie is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the listener could go to the website and find out why UNESCO says so. But why do you think it's a UNESCO World Heritage? Like, what do you think the value is that it has that makes it so important?
UNESCO is an organization that came into being after the Second World War, of course, and its mission is to build peace through understanding and education and scientific collaboration and such. And part of its program is the operation of the World Heritage Site program. These are sites that are said to have what is called outstanding universal value. In other words, these are sites that every human being should be able to connect with. And by connecting with these sites, we will learn something not just particular about these sites, but something about humanity itself. So that's sort of the broad picture. Under that rubric, this site was put forward by the Canadian government some years back. It worked its way through the system. I became involved with that around 2008 or 9 as part of a group that was commissioned by Parks Canada to formulate what was the outstanding universal value of the site. And essentially, the group came down to two major points, one of which deals really with a kind of localized phenomenon, which is the Acadian story, the story of the development of this unique culture and its successes and its resilience. And Grand Prairie itself is a place of memory because of the whole deportation narrative, the way it's been memorialized there. So that's one aspect of it. The other is broader and deals with the things that we were just discussing a moment ago, the landscape, see, I told you it would come back. So the landscape and the testing of human ingenuity against, in this case, the radical environmental challenge of the Fundy tides and the introduction of that diking system, which still continues to this day. So those are the two main reasons why the site has been awarded, as it was in 2012, by this UN status. Naturally, it could be applied to other places. Certainly the dikeland aspect was right across the region. And the deportation, although it's not remembered and commemorated at all of these sites across the region, it certainly did unfold across the region. So, if anything, as much as my work has been centered, parts of it have been centered at Grand Pre, I like it when the work extends beyond that footprint and beyond that spotlight, because there are really important stories out there in the hinterland as well.
Yeah.
And so
yeah,
do you think that Grand Pre is particularly important, or became sort of a stand-in for some of those other sites? Is it because of the Longfellow poem? Is it because of that sort of commemoration that even preceded the UNESCO designation? Is that why it stands in for the other ones?
You'll have to buckle up for a historical irony here, and this is something we go into at great length in the book. So,
excellent.
I mentioned John Winslow. So he was the fellow from Massachusetts that brought the deportation to Grand Pre in the fall, late summer and fall of 1755. He recorded his activities in an orderly book. It's sometimes called a journal or a diary. And properly speaking, it's an orderly book. It's a kind of military record that officers in the 18th century kept. So all the orders sent or received, supplies, finances, how many barrels of peas, you can imagine.
The rum ration.
Oh yeah. Very, very important, the rum ration. So all of these little details are recorded in this book. And when he returned home to Massachusetts, he brought his book with him. And it stayed in the family until the very end of the 18th century, when it was deposited in the Massachusetts Historical Society in downtown Boston, where it still is, where I've seen it. And I invite you to go and see it. It's a remarkable document. And that book offers a day-by-day account of the deportation of the Acadians at Grand Pre. When the first histories were being written of 18th century Nova Scotia, the very early 19th century, especially by Halliburton consulted Winslow. And so when you read the earliest histories, particularly, starting with Halliburton, the 1755 and the deportation of the Acadians is about Grand Pre.
Right.
Because his primary source was John Winslow. And then, in the middle of the 19th century, when the poet Longfellow began preparing his work, he went to the library at Harvard, among other places, and he picked off the shelves his source materials, and what did he find but T.C. Halliburton? So he built his poem around Grand Pre, built his poem around John Winslow, the destroyer, who now gets remobilized in a poetic work that becomes world famous and inadvertently plants the seeds of an Acadian national reawakening at the end of the 19th century. So great irony there that John Winslow, in documenting his destruction of this community, would play a critical role in this boomerang effect, which would help to create the modern Acadian nation.
Yeah, and I think
about this, I believe, right? And we'll put that in the show notes. There's an article you've done, Jonathan, about commemoration at Grand Pre.
Yeah, there's a couple little bits and pieces here and there along the way, and I just find it amazing because it just goes to show you the unintended consequences that hover around our actions.
Yeah. I think there's this idea in the popular conscious that like the 1755, and there's sort of this one event of people being marched out to a boat, but that's not the case, right? Like this was an event that took place over a couple of years and in a variety of different locations and played out over, these tragedies kind of were recurrent and over huge areas, basically.
Very true. If you've ever watched a movie based on a book and come out saying, well, it was good, but it was nowhere near as good as the book was because the book had just so much more in it. They always have to shave it down. Well, Longfellow shaved it down. And so even at Grand Pre, Winslow arrives, I think, on August 19th, and he doesn't leave until, his troops don't leave until, I think, January. So there it's several months. It's just a few days in Longfellow. So the closer you look, the more you see.
So Winslow is the British captain, but the first book in the Acadian deportation series revolves around Jeremiah Bancroft. And so what was Bancroft's role at Grand Pre?
Yeah, Bancroft was an ensign, so he was a junior officer. Winslow was a New England. By the way, these guys were New Englanders. They were British in the broadest sense. This is pre-revolutionary times. And in fact, many of the officers and not a few of the men who served in this military operation went on to become significant players in the Revolutionary War period. Winslow himself died just before the Revolution. He almost certainly would have been a royalist. He had royal sympathies straight the way through, but he died and was gone before Lexington and Concord and all the rest of it. But many of his family members, including two of his sons, were purged and sent north. Well, anyway, it's a complicated history. But Bancroft was just an ensign. He was a junior officer who just happened to have an interest in documenting his experience. And so remarkably, what you get is a very detailed, orderly book on the part of the superior officer, Winslow, who's the commander of this detachment, and a tiny little document by this much more junior figure who totally forgotten by history, Bancroft. And it allows us, in the way that we like to do, whether you're a journalist or whether you're investigating a crime or whether you're a historian, you want to gather your evidence and then see how the different testimonies relate and interrelate. So bizarrely, we can do that at Grand Pre in 1755 because we have not only Winslow, but we have Bancroft. We would love to have more. Sadly, we don't.
And so, Jonathan, you've generously slipped us in here for an interview, and so we're going to discuss for a minute here, I guess, the equipment that you're delaying loading into your car, probably. So I hope this doesn't cost too much. But we've talked about the digging holes, we've talked about some of the literature that you use through this work, but you're also an expert in geophysical techniques. And could you tell us a bit about what sort of geophysical tools you're using at Grand Pre and how these are contributing to the story that you're telling?
It's a bit of an involved area, geophysics and remote sensing. I'll summarize, and maybe down the road, if you guys are interested, I'd be happy to have further conversation. But let's start with a little story. I got involved in this work through, it's just serendipity, through a couple of friends. I don't know if you know Rob Ferguson, Parks Canada, former Parks Canada archaeologist. Rob's a good buddy, and for many years we co-taught the field school at Grand Pre National Historic Site. So he was the Parks Canada archaeologist, I was the university archaeologist, and we'd rent a couple vans, fill them with students, go down, dig, do the work. Brilliant experience, and Rob is a terrific guy. And anyway, just before we got into that, Rob was an early adopter of terrestrial geophysics here. A very enterprising guy, very competent field archaeologist. And Rob met, I'm not even sure really how, a guy from industry, since become a good friend, Duncan McNeil, who was the owner and president of Geonics Limited, which is a Canadian manufacturer of geophysical equipment based in Mississauga, Ontario. So now we're going back to probably 1999, 2000, thereabouts. And I met Duncan through Rob. Rob had been using some of Duncan's equipment over in PEI at Greenwich, doing landscape scale prospection for pre-deportation Acadian sites over there. Back in those days, of course, the equipment involved placing the instrument on the ground, pressing the trigger to take a sample, and then picking it up, moving it the next meter, bending over, pressing the trigger, picking it up, and you end up...
That's not any better than digging.
No, it's some serious troglodyte activity, right? Like it's very, very bad for your back. Now, since then, the equipment has moved on, and so you just walk over the ground with it. It just does automatic logging, and of course, we've gone through various iterations. Now we have Bluetooth and all this kind of stuff. So anyway, I met Duncan, and Duncan is a fascinating guy, very interesting guy. Comes from a scientific background, a little bit like my colleague Earl Lockerbie, who I've written this book with. Earl comes from nuclear science. He's a scientist who's retired and has a love of history and has been writing history books avocationally as a historian. Duncan, similarly, business guy, loves history, loves archaeology, and has been engaged with trying to apply his high-tech tools at archaeological sites. So we began collaborating at Grand Pre using what was called the EM38B, which is an electromagnetic induction instrument. This instrument was developed for the environmental sector and looking for scanning for contamination and looking at soil salinity and different things. But come to find out, it can also see archaeology. It does so by looking at, effectively, it's sort of like a resistivity meter, but it does conductivity. It's the inverse of resistivity. Buried stones are not very conductive of an electrical current because they're denser or less moisture. So there you go. But it does something really quite special called magnetic susceptibility. So it can detect soil magnetism. And variations in soil magnetism can be natural, but they can also be caused by architectural investment, people building something, particularly with stone. And a lot of the stone that people have built with in the Annapolis Valley is very highly magnetic basalt that the glaciers scraped off North Mountain and deposited on the valley floor. It's very hard, it's very prismatic, great building material. You can hold a fridge magnet to it and it'll stick.
Really?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Go get a magnet and a string. It's one of my parlor tricks for some of the students who join us for the first time. You hold a magnet on a string next to a piece of basalt and it just snaps right to it. So the instrument sees this very
You sound like
clearly.
great soils to screen. No wonder you got into
yeah. Well, I didn't even talk about the clay, but so it can see that without getting too much into the science of it. It can also see areas that have been burned. So we've used the instrument to detect pre-contact hearths, several hundred years old. You burn a building, John Winslow, 1755. Let me tell you, you can see that. So when you are looking for a village and you've got a series of open pastures, if you walk around with this instrument in linear transects back and forth and you end up mapping it, well, I can tell you that these house sites, burnt house sites especially, really stand out, and they allow you to target your excavations in the same way that maybe an X-ray or an MRI would allow a surgeon to target a surgery. And it's super powerful equipment. And we've since iterated beyond that and gone into radar and other techniques, but it's been a great test bed for these technologies in archaeology in Canada.
Very cool. And so just briefly before we go, you mentioned you can detect hearths with it. And so do we know much about the pre-Acadian history or the Mi'kmaq history at Grand Pré? And is some of the work that you're kind of picking up through resistivity and these surveys, is that kind of contributing to how you're finding this?
We do find evidence of Mi'kmaq ancestral activity. In fact, even at Grand Pré National Historic Site a few years ago, going back probably 2013 now, over top of a piece of the Acadian cemetery there is a ancestral Mi'kmaq site, which we discovered quite by accident because it wasn't very evident geophysically, but we were trenching just very shallow trenches to try to ground truth and determine the borders of the cemetery, so mapping the grave shafts. And as we were trenching across the plow zone, basically at the top, we hit some lithic scatters and some really interesting materials that were much older than the Acadian presence. So in this and other ways, you can see evidence of the Mi'kmaq site, or the Mi'kmaq presence, I should say. You can also see it through the historical record. It's not as if these two populations didn't integrate. Some of the people in the cemetery are Mi'kmaq people. We know this from the parish registers. We know that there were Mi'kmaq people being baptized in the Catholic Church at Grand Pré and many other communities, and marriages celebrated there, burials. But the major Mi'kmaq population center appears to have been obviously somewhat mobile, but based in the neighboring Gaspereau River Valley. Quite interested in the fish of the same name. Yeah. So, but there are Mi'kmaq sites all around that landscape, and there's that magic word again.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Jonathan. And we're looking forward to the Winslow book, and we really appreciate you taking the time to come on and tell us about it and about Grand Pré.
I hope you like footnotes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan, and really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks a lot, guys. Much appreciated.